Welcome everybody, and thank you for being part of this experience. I'm also grateful to our adult education members who are here and co-chairs and others who helped make today possible. Of course, I'm grateful to Hank Roubicek for making this possible too, and for reaching out to us and saying, might this be something that we could do for our congregants, especially as we look to Yom HaShoah, which starts tonight and goes till tomorrow. The community-wide Holocaust Memorial experience, the service just concluded this afternoon from Congregation Beth Israel, and we're able to continue the commemoration. So Hank's words and stories will set us up for this commemoration that goes through tomorrow as well. Just a brief introduction of Hank that I wanted to share with all of us so that we know what a treat we're really in for this afternoon's program, this evening's program, which will go about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for more opportunities to learn and to ask questions of Hank. But Dr. Hank Roubicek is a professor emeritus of communication studies at the University of Houston downtown. He's an award-winning educator and consultant, included several times in Who's Who Among American College Teachers, the founder and lead host of So What's Your Story on Houston's KPFT 90.1 FM. Host of the podcast, The Story Voice, and author of several books, including So What's Your Story? Discovering the Story in You, and contributor to Studies in Mythology, published by Oxford Press. His groundbreaking research in narrative expression has made him an internationally sought-after speaker and workshop facilitator. He's a contributor to Houston Matters, a Houston Moth storytelling champion, member of the National Storytelling Network, a board member of the Tejas Storytelling Association, and president of the Houston Storytellers Guild. He is the recipient of the prestigious Trailblazers Award issued by Tejas for pioneering storytelling in the Houston area. Dr. R, as he is affectionately called by students, is a community activist and a passionate advocate for tolerance education and veteran docent at Holocaust Museum Houston. Hank is husband to Peggy, grandpa to Jack, Tucker, and Tayton, and doggy daddy to Simon. And with that, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Hank to the conversation. Thank you for being with us. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much, I obviously have my photo here in black and white. I hope that doesn't bother anybody. The lighting makes this a little bit more appropriate, but if anybody is bothered by this, let me know. Besides, I'm telling stories that actually took place in the 30s or 40s. So I thought doing this in black and white would probably be more appropriate anyway. I'm so happy to be here. These are stories that I share with many different groups, but I have not had the good fortune of sharing some of these stories with my own congregation. It's sort of like, my gosh, everybody heard this except my family. So I'm really very, very grateful that David has given me the opportunity to be with you for a little while. Sometimes I have a tendency to ramble, like most storytellers. So I actually have some notes in front of me. So if I look down once in a while, you'll understand what I'm doing. David had mentioned that I am a veteran docent at the Holocaust Museum. That is literally one of the most important things that I do. And when I do tours, which is primarily, but not exclusively, with middle school and high school students, what I tell them is that all of the numbers and all of the historical data, all the resources that we're going to learn about are really important. But fundamentally, the most important thing is to see a face. It's not about 6 million, it's not about 11.5 million, it's about a face, an impact on a life, something that's really made an indelible impression on us. So as a result, I really go heavy when I tell stories during a tour. I'm also responsible for training many of our docents about storytelling and why telling stories is so very appropriate. I think that telling stories is one of the most practical and effective ways of increasing tolerance and understanding among us. And there are a lot of reasons to believe that. Survivors display a very poignant kind of face. It's one of emotional resilience. And the second generation of which I'm a member, children, grandchildren, are really responsible for keeping those faces alive, those voices alive, but not only alive, but to make sure that those voices are always heard loudly and clearly. I am a second generation. I was born in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. I've been here in Houston for 41 years. My grandparents and my mother are from Kovno, Lithuania, from a shtetl called Schmaltz. When I first told my son that, he said, "What is that?" I said, "Well, watch Fiddler on the Roof. It's sort of like that." You know, Anatevka was a mythical village, although it really isn't. There is such a thing as Anatevka. But Schmaltz, that one sounds like a fake town, but it isn't. That's where they're from. My grandmother and my mother were in Stutthof concentration camp for 3.5 years. My grandfather in Dachau. I never met 2/3 of my family. My mother's alive, semi-well, in Florida. She's 92 years old. By South Florida standards, I suppose that's sort of young. I didn't hear any of the voices of these very significant people who spoke to me growing up. And I grew up with hundreds of survivors surrounding me in that neighborhood. And they really made up the landscape of that neighborhood, as you'll soon learn. But even though I didn't hear their voices then, I hear them now. And it always makes an impression on me. Sometimes it's very difficult to go through these stories, despite the fact that some of them are rather funny. But they hit me because, like most stories, when I tell them, they unfold in front of me. You know what I mean? It's like you see them. I don't know how else to describe them, but I see my house, I see my backyard, I see the butcher shop, I hear the languages, I see the people. I never knew anything else. And it was a wonderful, wonderful environment. I never thought I'd ever create stories from it because, frankly, I never thought anyone would be interested in the stories that I tell. But, you know, that's the beautiful thing about storytelling. We don't have to be very adventurous. I'm not adventurous at all. I mean, I don't like adventure. My idea of adventure is when, you know, room service is late. I don't think about adventure much. But to me, the idea of adventure is to go back into your life, because I believe that we're all born with a blank book. And on each page, we write our own story, right? And as we get older, which I certainly am, which many of us are, we realize that our lives is our story and our stories are lives. There's really no other way to phrase that. And my stories are snapshots of lives that my family experienced in the camps, reflections of liberation, times when instinct kept them alive, but mostly they're stories about moments frozen in time. And when I tell a story, it's as if that moment frozen in time is being thawed. It's being thawed. And that's how I see them.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of my second generation peers tell me that their families never talked much about the Holocaust growing up. They kept most of them in the dark. Well, that was true for my grandfather and my mother. We all lived in the same house and they didn't talk much. But my grandmother, Grammy, whoa, she was not shy. Not shy. Everything was about the Holocaust. But let me start at the very beginning, if I may. I entitle this concert, for a lack of another word, Schmaltz on Rye, right? Okay. When I was in graduate school, all of our mothers and our grandparents packed, you know, boxes, just boxes of stuff that we would need, care packages, if you will. So I'm in graduate school and I'm rooming with 3 guys, really wonderful, wonderful guys. None of them are Jewish. And my grandmother sends this box. Okay, so we open up, oh, hey, what's in it? And in that box, one of my roommates, John, takes this jar out with this yellow solidified stuff. And he looks at me and he says, "What in the hell is this?" I tell him that is Schmaltz. He said, "What?" I said, "It's Schmaltz, it's chicken fat." He says, "Chicken fat? What do you do with it?" I said, "Well, you spread it on bread with grivetas, and you don't want to go that route, John. Just trust me. That's what you do." He says, "How poor are you people?" was his first response. I said, well, pretty poor, but that's not the point. Okay, so he's all grossed out, so are my other two roommates. So that night, the chicken schmaltz is sitting in the freezer in the back. And I come down, I don't know how else to phrase it. You'll have to forgive me. I'm not a drug addict, but everybody was stoned that day. So I come down at 3 o'clock in the morning to get a glass of water, right? I'm 23 years old. And my friend John is sitting there at the table with this jar of schmaltz open and a knife and a loaf of Wonder Bread, which was a problem, those of you who know how to eat schmaltz. And he's sitting there spreading this schmaltz on bread. And he says, this is the greatest stuff I've ever eaten in my life. So we'll put some salt on it and stuff. It'll be even better. So he eats this stuff because he's obviously starved after the ingestion that he took all day. And we sat there at that table and he looked at me and he said, tell me about your life. That's a true story. Tell me about your life at 3:15. At 8 o'clock that morning, I wasn't quite done, but I finished because I figured he had enough. It was the single best conversation I ever had in my life. You know, food brings people together. I'm not sure if you could categorize that in this episode, but that's what I did. I told him all about my life. Now, we're communication graduate students, so there was a lot to that because we were really into accessing information from people and making these revelations. But it was all about Schmaltz that brought us together. Well, there's a lot more about that, and I'll share that with you a little bit later. But for now, let me tell you that my grandmother was, I swear, the best storyteller God ever created. There isn't anything that she ever said unless it was in story form, okay? So for example, if I went up to her and I were to say, Grammy, what's for dinner? She would never tell me what's for dinner. Instead, she'd sit me down and tell me a story about a little boy at a circus. Now, I'm 5 years old and I'm sitting there with my eyes rolling, going, oh my God, now I have to listen to her story for the next 20 minutes about something that's totally irrelevant. But that's what we had to do. I sat there for 20 minutes. I listened about this little boy at a circus. And you found out that it really wasn't about a little boy at a circus at all. It was about never asking her what's for dinner again. And you didn't know that until the end of the story. If she didn't have a story for you, then she would come up with these rhetorical questions. She'd answer a question with a question, but she would do it in a prompting way. So for example, if I would ask her, Grammy, do you like my girlfriend? She would say, well, I was at the post office last week and I didn't see her picture up on the wall. But do you like her? Well, she had dinner over here last week and I could see that she knew how to use a knife and fork. But Grammy, do you like her? Do you like her? I'm sure she didn't kill anybody. Well, I got the idea. That's her way of saying she's nothing special. But she couldn't say that. She had to give me all of these images first in order for me to try to figure them out. And if she didn't do that, then she was always good at offering these apocryphal stories. You know, the kind like George Washington. I don't mean to bust anybody's balloon, but he really didn't chop down a cherry tree. But if he had, and his father said, did you chop down that tree? George Washington would have said, Pa, I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down that tree with my little hatchet. That's an apocryphal story. It's about the person, the characteristic. It's about the credibility and dignity of an individual. So I remember once I was telling my mother about our friend Elliot Gross. I say our because Elliot lived down the street from us and he delivered kosher goods from Sam and Jack's butcher down the street. So he was over all the time, right? He'd just walk in the door and come down to the basement where my grandmother cooked and brought it in. And they always kibitzed a little bit. And I remember telling my grandmother, I said, Grandma, you know, Elliot's an interesting person. He's been engaged 4 times to 4 different people. And now he's engaged again. And I really wish him the best. Now this, of course, he's in his mid-20s at this point, right? And here's what she said. And she makes it sound like she just made it up, but I know she had it in her repertoire somewhere. She said, you know, there was a young man who had two shirts, saying, I'm talking about engagement. There's a young man, she says, go with me. He had two shirts and he couldn't decide which one to wear to school. So he missed school. And when he did go to school, he never had an answer to the question, what is your favorite subject? Because he couldn't decide, she said. He had a few, but he just couldn't decide. At the candy store, he was a real mess because, like all kids, they want candy. But at the candy store, he couldn't decide on the candy he wanted, so he went candy-less. His mother, may she rest in peace, always used to make buffets. My grandmother said he never knew what to take, so he went hungry. So at that point, I would ask my grandmother, okay, Grammy, that's an interesting story. What's the point? And she would say, don't go out and buy a suit. Okay, I got it. But it was the story. It was the story that I had to listen to in order to get it. Now, why is this important? Because I'm telling you the story now. I didn't tell you the lesson about, hey, it's important to make a decision. It's the story, right? That taught me something about making decisions and about this young man being a case study for being indecisive. If my mother, we all live in the same house, so just like any other kids, I get mad at my mom, right? And I would say things like, my mother doesn't love me. So my grandmother tells me this interesting story, which I really will never forget. It's about a young man who kills his mother. And I'm going, whoa, just go with me here. Just listen to me. She says, this young man is engaged. And the woman says to him, you cannot marry me unless you prove your love to me. And the only way to prove your love to me is to kill your mother. Well, he says, I'm not going to kill my mother for you or anybody else. Okay. Well, then you can't marry me. Young man thinks about it and says, I really love this woman. She's really beautiful and I can't be without her. So I'm going to go ahead and kill my mother. So he walks into the kitchen one night where his mother is cooking, takes a butcher knife, walks up to his mother and kills her. So he thinks. He leaves her for dead, but she's not dead. She's lying on the floor, dying. He panics. He runs out of the kitchen and he trips on pots and pans. And his mother, in her dying breath, raises her head and asks, did you hurt yourself? Yeah. So to my grandmother, that was the definition of a mother's love. And it always touches me because, for so many years, I thought, what a stupid story. I thought, give me a break. But, it isn't. It was a beautiful story. And I understood exactly what she meant because after a while, I realized that that's exactly what a mother's love is, a father's too, but a mother's love is kind of special. If I would ask her questions like, he's rich, she would say, did you count his money? I would say, I have to rush through this, Grammy. I have to do my homework, to which she would say, go do it again. But I would say, I'm rushing through something. I'm in a rush. She would say, a good tailor should measure 10 times before cutting. Now, these are anecdotes. These are not necessarily stories. I guess you could call them quick-hitting narratives, but they always made sense to me. And I remember thinking, well, every day is today, not tomorrow, because I was always encouraged to do exactly what I could do today rather than waiting for tomorrow. My grandmother cooked in the basement because she didn't want to get the kitchen dirty. Here's a whole different agenda here for you. I told my mother a bunch of years ago, I said, I've been diagnosed as being obsessive compulsive, and I think it's your fault. She said, don't be ridiculous. I don't care what anybody says. Being OCD is not hereditary. I said, really? Okay, really? Because Grandma used to cook in the kitchen, in the basement, so she wouldn't get the kitchen dirty. Of course, somehow there would be these beautiful, incredible dishes of incredible food, obviously, in these beautiful dishes manifesting itself from the basement. I don't even know where she stored them down there, but they would come up from the basement as if she had 42 gourmet chefs down there and 16 party planners. And she would bring all the stuff up from the basement, right? Because she didn't want to cook in the kitchen. She had a rug, all right? We had a rug with fringes on it under the dining room table. She had a rake. She had to rake the fringes, okay? She had to puff up the pillows before she went to bed. She had to do everything one particular way. My grandfather drank tea every night at 7:45, whether he liked it or not. He works in a warehouse. He was up at 4 o'clock every morning. I worked with him a few summers. And he was exhausted when he came home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And in the evening, after Walter Cronkite, he'd be asleep. And at 7:45, my grandmother would ask him to come into the kitchen and drink tea. He's exhausted, but she fed him with caffeine. So he gets up, almost like a robot, walking into the kitchen, drinks tea, doesn't even know what he's drinking. There was never, we had cups, but she usually used those jelly glasses, you know, the Flintstone and stuff. You had to drink tea from a glass because that was the painful way of doing it. You couldn't use a cup. You needed a glass with a thing of hard sugar. And then, of course, she baked things and everything ended with cha, you know, kichala, rogalach, tegalach, whatever it was. That's what you had with your tea at 7:45 at night. She never locked the door, ever. We didn't lock doors in those days anyway. And when you walked into the house, you had to, and I mean you had to. You had to, or you were thrown in jail. You had to take your shoes off. Couldn't walk into the house with your shoes on, all right? But no, OCD is nothing. Okay, you had to take your shoes off. Now, the interesting thing is, I'd be coming down from my room from upstairs, and my cousins and my aunts would be sitting in the living room. I didn't even know they walked in. I didn't know they were there. They're simply sitting there waiting for somebody to greet them with their shoes off. How did they sneak in? They had their shoes off. The only exception is that if it was snowing, you know, you'd hear them hitting their boots on the ground. Then you had a sense that somebody was there. So everything was done meticulously and ritualistically. And despite the fact that it seemed sick, I loved every moment of it. Every moment of it. The last Thursday of the month, my grandmother, she was riddled with arthritis. She couldn't walk very well. So her brothers and sisters would come over our house. She had 13 brothers and sisters. Half of them died in the war. They were all living 1.5 miles away from us. That's all, 1.5 miles away. Except for my Aunt Bessie, who lives in Chicago. The last Thursday of every month, they would come over and have family night. What it consisted of is as much food as you can eat, as much stuff as you can drink, as many pennies as you can gamble, as many cigarettes as you can smoke, as loud as you can scream for like the next 6 hours. And I was upstairs having to hear it all. It was the warmest, most incredible several hours of love I ever heard in my life. They were yelling at each other. They screamed at each other. My Uncle Sam always went to sleep about 2 o'clock in the morning on the ground with an unlit cigarette in his mouth. It was as natural as the lamp on the table. People just walked over him. I thought every house was like that. I thought everybody had an uncle who slept on the ground with an unlit cigar. That's what my house looked like. That's what it was like the last Thursday of every month. You know, I'll never forget talking about my grandmother's family. My Aunt Ruthie, her youngest sister, excuse me, had a daughter, Elaine, who was my grandmother's niece, of course. And she was engaged to a young man who was at one time going to be a priest. Well, my Aunt Ruthie, as you might imagine, went nuts. I mean, my God, dating out of the faith. And this is the interesting thing. My grandmother was a stickler for that, like every other grandmother. You can't marry a non-Jewish girl. You can't do this, you can't do that. But you know what? She was the epitome of fairness. Because if somebody was engaged to someone who wasn't Jewish, she somehow rendered this level of fairness that nobody else could do. So, for example, when her sister, my Aunt Ruthie, would cry and scream and talk about disowning Elaine if she were to actually marry this guy, it was my grandmother who said to her, look, they love each other. It's a common phrase, right? But somehow when she said it, it sounded as if it was the first time it was ever said. It meant something. But you know, my grandmother always had the last word about everything, regardless of the topic. So, for example, I mentioned that this young man at one time wanted to be a priest, right? Well, it was my grandmother who really opened my Aunt Ruthie's eyes about the importance of them being together, because love eclipses everything, right? It was the most important thing. But Michael, who was my cousin's husband, Michael, the one who was going to be a priest, loved my grandmother because it was because of her that they really were able to get married. Hope you're following me. He loved my grandmother, so he always talked to her about things. And one of the things he loved talking to my grandmother about, because she was very well read and open-minded, at least in front of other people, was about religion. At one time, I overheard them talking in the kitchen, because everything took place in the kitchen. And Michael, the one who wanted to be a priest one day, is talking to my grandmother about Christianity and explains to her his point of view, talks about Jesus. And then I'm right there, well, outside the door, overhearing them. And he says, well, Aunt Razel, what do you think about Jesus? And my grandmother turns to him and says, and I quote, he was a wonderful boy, but God? And that was it. That's all he said. And suddenly the world made sense, right? And suddenly the world made sense. Everybody liked talking to her because she was such a great conversationalist. She could entertain you all day. My great-grandfather, Fishel Miller, always wore this black suit and had a white starched shirt on, and he came over all the time. Always had a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. He smoked 2 packs of Winston's every day, died at 103. Must have been the cigarettes that killed him, right? But, he came over all the time, and he would sit there, and my grandmother would talk with him, and somehow he would entertain her, and she would entertain him. And somehow, when everybody came over to the house, my grandmother had this way of entertaining you. I can't really explain it, but somehow it was the matter of her telling stories. It was the cadence in her voice. Well, it was just everything. One of my favorite stories that I like to share, and I'm not really telling you any stories, I'm telling you a lot of anecdotes, but I do have a few full-fledged stories that I'm going to share, and this is one of them. One of the things that I always loved about being raised by survivors, although I didn't know it until later in life, was being able to deal with a lot of the dread and a lot of the trauma, because there is a lot. Sociologists love people like me. This transgenerational trauma is really very real. And I'll tell you why. It's because we're told not to be weak. So, for example, I've always been depressed as a child. I'm certainly not afraid of admitting that. I was depressed, right? And my grandmother would turn to me and say, why are you depressed? I'm 5 years old. Why are you depressed? What concentration camp were you in? I'm 5 years old. I have no idea what a concentration camp is, but I assumed that I had to, that I should have. So somehow I figured, okay, I wasn't in one, so I shouldn't be depressed. It didn't change my mood, but somehow I realized very quickly that I could not be weak, and I resented that. I did. And that's why it's hard for many second-gen people to understand fully why they were exposed to the kinds of things to which they were exposed. And when you're in a house with several generations, 2 generations of survivors, well, it's that double entendre that you're getting each and every day. But the best thing that you learn to overcome some of these traumas is to learn something as simple as courtesy and that other people matter. Every Friday for 3 years, from 8th grade through the beginning of 11th grade, every Friday at 4 o'clock, I had to walk down the end of the street to Drexler's drugstore to buy my grandparents the Jewish Forward. Many of you know what that was, right? The Jewish newspaper. It was delivered soon after that, but until then, it was my job to walk down to the end of the street and buy the Jewish Forward. And I did. Now, the first time I ever did that, I made a big mistake. I walked by a store named called Maury's Shoe Store. Maury Malzmacher was a friend of my grandparents. He was a survivor. He was in Auschwitz, as a matter of fact, Auschwitz-Birkenau, had his tattoo. And when I walked by the first time of these 3.5 years, the first time I waved. Hi, Mr. Malzmacher. It's Friday, right? Hi, Mr. Malzmacher. He came out and he said, "You call that a hello?" He said, "Well, I just waved. I'm walking down the end of the street to get my grandfather the newspaper." He said, "That's not a hello." Walked back into the store. And he's a shoe salesman and a cobbler. Trying to make conversation, I would say, "Yeah, I probably will need a new pair of shoes soon." And he said, "Well, I fixed those last year. What's wrong with them?" I said, "Okay, nothing." He sold shoes for a living. And he asked me how my grandparents were. And then he asked me, "Do you see Sylvia?" who was his daughter, who went to school with me. I said, "Yeah, I see Sylvia." And we talked for a few minutes. And then I leave, continue down the street to get my grandparents, the Jewish Forward, and then come back. But I couldn't dare walk on the other side of the street because he'd think I was ignoring him. So I had to walk back the same side of the street. And I couldn't just walk back and wave again. We're just talking about less than 5 minutes later. I walked into the store again and I said, "Mr. Malzmacher, it was really nice talking with you. Have a good Shabbos, and I'll see you next week." That's all I said. That's all he wanted. I did that every Friday. And what I realized isn't very profound, and I'm sorry that this sounds so simple, but what I realized is that just spending a few minutes with someone else is the single most important thing you can do. And I learned all of those years listening to my grandparents growing up that spending those moments with family, you know, those crazy Thursday family nights with my uncle sleeping on the floor with an unlit cigarette, a cigar in his mouth, my great-grandfather coming over with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, drinking tea out of a glass, going through all of those rituals. There were simple little idiosyncrasies, which at the time did not mean a whole lot. But when you put them together, it's a mosaic of a life. It's a little piece to a puzzle of life. You put them all together, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. You put them all together in pieces where they belong, and you've got this portrait of a life worth living. Nothing ever exciting in my life. Never took vacations, never really went to restaurants. We didn't really have the money. And of course, survivors, you know, they didn't do that kind of stuff. They worked hard, told you to do your homework, you know, told you at a very early age to become a professional person. Even when I took pots and pans out of her cupboard and started to bang on them at the age of 4, she said how cute that was, but it won't help you become a heart surgeon. You know, that's the kind of life you led. But she loved this country. Boy, she loved this country. And she thought that this was a country that gave you an opportunity to spend time with people and to nurture and to cultivate all of those beautiful things that we learn about valuing our lives. She used to explain to people that television was a great way, she said, of learning about America. She really did. And when you considered her favorite shows, you could understand why. So, for example, she loved Gunsmoke, because here's a handsome guy with a gun who didn't have to use them. He was able to talk himself out of trouble and reason with people, right? She loved Bonanza, but she couldn't stand when Hoss was picked on, because he's such a nice man. Stop picking on him is what she would think. She loved Columbo because even though he was a schlump, he was really very smart. She loved Ed Sullivan because it was a variety show and it exposed her to the Beatles, who she realized really wasn't that bad. She loved Lawrence Welk. She loved Bishop Sheen. All survivors loved Bishop Sheen. I couldn't understand why, but he was a smart boy. Even though he was 83, it doesn't make any difference how old you were. He was a smart boy. Okay. She owned the TV. She loved television. And in June 1st, 1962, you know that date, it's when Adolf Eichmann was sentenced to death. It was the day he died for war crimes in Jerusalem. And I remember watching the television and the words across the screen. Adolf Eichmann was just executed in Jerusalem for war crimes. And I remember turning to my grandmother asking, who is this guy? And she told me who he was. And the first thing that I said was, well, that happened a gazillion years ago. Who cared? You know, it was 17 years after the war. That's all. When I do a tour, I make it very clear to the kids that are on my tour that this is called a museum, but it's not. There are no dinosaurs here. There are approximately 200,000 survivors remaining on the planet. Roughly 1,200 die each day. So in the near future, it might be a museum, but in the meantime, it isn't. And there are voices echo through every chamber of this building. And understand that there are no dinosaurs here. There are people who remember everything clearly and concisely. And that was the first time I really ever heard about the Holocaust. My grandmother saved my mother twice in concentration camps. I told you they were in Stutthof concentration camp. For those of you who know the history of the Holocaust, you know that the age 14 was very significant. When my grandmother was with my mother at Stutthof, she had heard the number 14. She didn't know what the number age 14 meant. She really didn't, but she was very intuitive, very instinctive. And it was also a form of resistance to be intuitive. That was a way of being resistant. So she kept hearing the number 14, although she didn't exactly know what that meant. So she and my mother were at the check-in counter, so to speak, and the Gestapo was there, and the Gestapo asked my mother, how old are you? And my grandmother pinched my mother real hard, and she screams, ouch. And then my grandmother chimes in, telling the Gestapo, oh, she stepped on a stone. She's 14 years old. It turns out when you're under the age of 14, you are sent immediately to the chamber and you are killed. So my grandmother had to lie about her age in order for my mother to live, in order for me to be here and share a few tales with you. When they were liberated, many of you know about the death marches, and some of the major death marches were in Stutthof, because Stutthof was the first camp on the Polish border as the Russians, the Red Army, was coming over the Eastern Front. So it was very important for the Germans to expose of the evidence, especially at Stutthof, because again, it was the first camp. So there was some saliency, some urgency about getting rid of all of these people. My grandmother explains the story that she was in this death march with my mother and two friends who were behind them. And she knew that they were going to be killed. She knew this. Again, this was one of those intuitive things that she knew. And she saw that there was a time when the guards were not around them. There was a small shack, not unlike a tool shed where we might keep our tools in the backyard, falling apart, a little shed, a little shack, which was about 30 yards away, she said. And when the guards weren't looking, she grabbed my mother by her hair because my mom was terrified, and the two friends behind them, and they ran into that little shed. They darted right into it, shut the door, and hid. Just a few moments later, my grandmother says, she hears just a smattering of machine guns, and all of the women in that line where they were slaughtered. All of them, all of them. And less than 10 minutes later, my grandmother knew several languages, including Russian. She heard Russian voices outside of this shed. They were Russian soldiers there to liberate them. Just 10 minutes later. So, Grammy just opens the shed door with my mother and the two friends, and they're liberated because they heard the voices twice. After the war, they went to Lodz for a while because they didn't yet have a sponsor. And, you needed a sponsor to come to this country. It turns out my great-grandfather was a sponsor, but he needed to get them a place to live and someplace to work. So my grandmother, they had some friends in Lodz, and they took a freight train there. And that in and of itself was a real escapade, and it's a very long story, so I'll spare you the extensive details right now, but they were in Lodz, and when they were there, they asked if anybody saw my grandfather, because he also knew people in Lodz. They didn't. Turns out at the same time, my grandfather, who was in Dachau, was looking for my mother and my grandmother. He didn't know where to start, really. And he saw someone who said, I think that your wife and your daughter, my mother had a son, a brother and a sister who were killed. But I think that your wife and your daughter are in Lodz. So he went to find them. And my grandmother tells this story about getting off this freight train, seeing a friend of hers who asks her, well, did you see your husband? And my grandmother says, no, I'm looking for him. Have you seen yours? And my grandmother's friend says, no, I heard that my husband was killed. At that time, she takes off a wedding ring and gives it to my grandmother. My grandmother says, I'm not going to take this ring. That was your husband's ring. She says, no, you're a woman of hope. And I want to give you this ring because somehow I think it will help you find your husband, my grandfather. Well, with trepidation, she takes this ring and she finds my grandfather. He shows up on the street. That simple. Or is it? I didn't know about this ring until 12 years ago when I met my wife, married her, and my mother says, here, why don't you use this ring? I said, you have Grandpa's ring? Why didn't you tell me? She said, oh, I didn't like any of the others. So, yeah, she wanted me to use it with this wife, so she kept it. And this is the ring that my grandfather wore all of his life, the same ring that my grandmother's friend gave to her, and the ring that my grandfather left to me, that my mother gave to me when I was married, 12 years ago. I don't know. These artifacts are always sort of interesting, aren't they? Because these artifacts are always the kinds of things that really make us think about our lives differently. My mother was interviewed by one of Spielberg's people, the Shoah documentary in 1994. And I'll never forget, she had a small frame with a weed in it, a dandelion, a dead dandelion, just a weed. And the interviewer asked my mother, "What is that?" And my mother explains that this was a flower that my father, my grandfather, gave to my mother when they were separated and we went to the camps. And my grandmother somehow held on to this flower, this dry weed, for 3.5 years. Found a way to keep it somehow intact. And then eventually, when they came to this country, she put it in a small frame. Which doesn't really surprise me. My grandmother could take a weed and make a beautiful bouquet into it. So I'm not surprised by that, by the fact that that dead dandelion in a little frame meant something to her. The ring, the dandelion, so many things, right? So many different things. Well, just to change the tone for a moment, my father, I didn't talk about him. My father, my biological father, was not a survivor. He was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and he left when I was 14 years old. He wasn't a bad man, but he was sick and he was weak. And that's one of the reasons I was so fortunate to have my grandparents, because they really did offer me the kind of guidance and the kind of structure that most could only envy. My grandfather was a man of very few words, but every word meant something. And he never said a bad word about anybody. I mean, never a bad word about anyone. My grandmother, she was a little different, but my grandfather, never a bad word about anyone. And after 3.5 years in Dachau, you might imagine, yeah, well, he probably had reason to, but he never, ever did. And that's when he used words at all. And he never did. He just really used other incredibly effective channels of expression to share his love. When he came home from this warehouse job at 3 o'clock, when I was a kid, I used to watch Leave It to Beaver. Many of you know Leave It to Beaver. He was on 4:30 Eastern time every afternoon. I'd be laying on the floor watching Leave It to Beaver, and all my grandfather would do would be to come up to me over my head while I'd be lying on the floor, and he'd shake a bag of M&Ms over me, knowing that was my favorite. He did that every day, just to let me know that he never forgot me. When I was 14, I stole a cigarette from my mother. I'm outside smoking a cigarette. It's a snowstorm, so I figured, who is going to be outside? I'm walking around, and who's coming at me? My grandfather is walking right toward me in a snowstorm while I'm smoking one of my mother's cigarettes. I don't know what to do. I mean, I can't do anything. Here I am, caught. And he walks up to me, and all he says is, that was it. Didn't say a word. Never ratted on me. Just don't do that again. I smoked for the next 20 years, but that's beside the point. But don't do that again. But you know what? My favorite memory is when I was 5 years old. He started to tell me a story every year. And this is one of my favorite stories. Every year he told me the same story, okay? The story was that he had this gold watch while he was in Dachau concentration camp. Now, I'm a kid. I have no idea what he's talking about, right? I had this watch, he says, when I was in Dachau concentration camp, but I kept it in my sock because I didn't want the Nazis to find it, he would say to me. It was also a symbol of hope that one day I would run across your mom and your grandmother again. That's what he said to me. Well, I listened to him, and I didn't really know what he was talking about, but I listened to him. I loved him. And I listened to that story 21 times. Because a few days after my 26th birthday, he was diagnosed with leukemia. We felt optimistic because a lot of elderly people deal with leukemia well. They survive, but it wasn't to be. He died soon afterwards. And a good friend of the family came up to me at his funeral, and they gave me a small box, cotton laced, And in it was that gold watch. And under it, a little piece of scratch paper that read, "I love you," which was typical for him because, again, he was a man of very, very few words, right? Very few words. And that's a story I never forget. I never forget that. The other day, someone asked me if I can think of something that really characterizes the trauma of a survivor, and one came to mind. My grandfather had a 55 Fairlane, white Fairlane, meticulous. And I looked inside of the driver's side, and I saw a cushion that he had to sit on because he was short, and it was the only way to look over the steering wheel. And I went over to the other side where my grandmother sat, and I closed my eyes, and I looked into that window of the passenger side, and you know what I saw? Crumbs from crackers that she would put in her purse, so that in the 1.5-mile drive down the street to see some of her brothers and sisters, she wouldn't starve. I didn't hear my grandparents' voices growing up, and I didn't really listen, even if I did hear them, I suppose. I sort of made up for it since then, I think. But every day, somehow, I see my grandmother walking and baking and setting the table and laughing and crying and praying. She guides me. She really is my compass. And I put all of that in story form if I can, and I try. But, ultimately, living with survivors showed me, and should show all of us, especially those of us who are second generation, something that actually Rabbi Lyon once said in one of his sermons years ago. And that is that we need to learn not so much who we are, but what we are. Probably the most satisfying thing I experience as a docent is the look of astonishment when kids on the tour, looking at their faces when I tell them a story about one of our Houston survivors. And then it's the expression of reverence and respect and veneration that I see on their faces. And I know it all works because, stories take us on journeys and then they return us safely to the present. And it's important to know. That's how we come together. It's how we come together. There's an old Yiddish proverb that says, what's truer than truth? The story. Oh, by the way, if you ever come across a jar of Schmaltz and you feel inspiration to start telling stories because you see that jar of Schmaltz, just make sure you use rye. Thank you.
Beautifully done. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Hank. Really remarkable. The comment, I can't even do it justice other than to read and to say that we all laughed and cried and felled, and we're so proud as well that we're Jewish. Thank you, Hank, for sharing your stories with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It took a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I'd be more than happy if you have time to respond to questions or hear your comments. That would be great.
Welcome to put comments or questions in the chat or unmute yourselves. Before we get to some of those, I just want to also remind everyone in terms of Yom HaShoah and Holocaust Memorial Day, and I loved the experiences that you shared from your work with the Holocaust Museum. And I'm wondering, with Israel and since October 7th, what else might have been or what might have recently come to you through some of your experiences at the museum tomorrow at 10 a.m., which is just in a few hours in Israel, siren throughout the entire country, and the entire country stops for 2 minutes, which is remarkable. And that question of hope and that seeking of hope and the resilience you talked about,
Right.
What is it that you've seen, or maybe that you heard through your work at the Holocaust Museum since October 7th that might respond to some of what we're dealing with?
That is a great question, David. That is a great question. First of all, we have a lot of speakers and a lot of things going on at the museum, and I urge you to check out the menu because it's quite extensive, first of all. But as docents, and this I don't think will surprise anybody, we really don't talk about October 7th because we are not interested. We're not interested in talking about anything that will inflame hatred. Anything. The mission of the museum is to be an upstander rather than a bystander, not to be passive. The last thing you want to be, is passive. But the best way to explain that is I tell kids that, they have their name tags on, and I say, Billy, if I'm your boss and I tell you that the only way to get Tommy's job is to push him down the stairs and break his legs, and you're ridiculous enough to listen to me, and you do that, I'm a man of my word, and I'm going to give you his job. But now a police officer is going to arrest you because that's an aggravated assault. What would you say? Well, unfortunately, a lot of our kids would say, well, it's my boss's fault. But that's not the answer, right? The answer is your fault because you've got to be able to make the right decision, correct? It's your fault. Every adult isn't smart. Every boss isn't going to give you the right advice. You have got to be able to make the right decision. Now, where I'm headed is this. When we talk about October 7th, we know in our heart who's right, who's wrong. We know that. We already know that. We know that. The problem is that those who don't see it our way will not listen to us. And those of you who do won't see it any other way. They'll see Palestinians as a security risk rather than people. And then we're going to see, Jews as people that we've always hated. You can't really get away from those two positions, is my point. So as docents, it's really difficult. We try to stay firm with the idea that we can't be passive and compliant. People do want to engage us in conversations about October 7th. They do all the time. And it's really hard. It's really, really hard. Because you usually get leading questions like, well, don't you think that Israel is really responding terribly about all of this? Well, yeah, they are in a way, and no, they're not in other ways. But I don't have time to get into this discussion right now. There's too much for them to learn that will help fill their repertoire on ways to overcome hate. So here's my point. When you engage that kind of conversation, sometimes you promote hate rather than mitigate it. I know that may not make a whole lot of sense, but that's what we do as docents collectively. Does that make any sense at all? Am I just rambling there? Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thank you for that perspective.
Yeah, it's hard. It's really, really hard. This is a picture of my grandparents. You can't really see it well, but that was 1918.
Remarkable.
Yeah. You can see them a little bit, yeah. 1918.
Does anybody else have a question or comment? Maybe something that you appreciated about Hank's stories, or another takeaway? Yeah, Martha, go ahead.
I wrote in the chat that Professor Roubicek was my professor for storytelling at University of Houston downtown.
I knew I recognized somebody familiar.
And it was the best class because through storytelling, he taught us, but you also learned about all the other people in the class.
Thank you.
Rare. And he put me on on his radio show. But anyway, I still have my story.
You had to have gotten an A, right? Yeah, okay.
I have an A. But I still have an A, but more importantly, I have my story.
No, I know, Martha, and I remember you. I do remember you, and I remember you telling me you're a member here, and all that stuff. Yeah.
So
It's a
anyway,
long
well, thank you.
time
I'm
ago.
here especially because I really honor you, Professor. So
It's
thank
a
you.
long, long time ago. Long time
was.
ago. Rain, I see that you're there. Rain Teller, who's a magnificent rabbi and storyteller herself. Pat, you're there. I know a lot of you, and I'm so glad that you showed up.
Thank you.
You're in
Thank
them.
you. That was lovely. Bonnie, you have a question.
No, just a comment that listening to you talk about your grandfather, you so much brought my grandfather back to me. He was the biggest influence in my life growing up and an outstanding man. And I thank you.
Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Bonnie.
Well, you are welcome. Definitely.
Everybody. And thank you, Hank. This was really
Thank you, David. I appreciate it.
spend
so
time.
much.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. And enjoy the rest of your evening as we think about and commemorate Yom HaShoah and tomorrow as well. And as we look ahead to better days and greater peace for all, for sure. Our programming is coming to an end at the congregation. We have a lot of planned for next year, but our annual meeting is June 4th. And between now and then, we're still accepting nominations for our Volunteer of the Year Award. So if you have things or ideas or suggestions of someone to nominate, please do so through our website. And we just really appreciate all of you being with us today. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.
God bless. Thank you again, everyone.